In this video, we're going to take a look at Akkerman's Gourmet Pink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This pink is not so bright that it's obnoxious on the page. Quite the opposite. It's gentle to look at and has very soft tones about it. Now, it gives really good tone variation in the writing by pen. And if you think that for a long time, Gourmet pens really liked the very wet, very broad pens, then the way this ink performs really does make sense if she was making an ink that was made for her, which we would look at this as. It gives good, I said the good tone variation, it gives very nice shading and brings out a great character in this ink, which you would hope with its namesake. Now, it's easy to read, and you can see that on the page here. This is a pink that is done well, which is hard to do, and I know I've seen a few pinks that do very well, but that only tends to happen when you chase down as many inks as you can. You find some of those difficult colors, and you find some that are done well. So the really good news is you can sample this ink, but you can also get it in full bottles as long as they keep making it. And I don't mean Aziza, because she's not mixing this up in her kitchen. As far as the manufacturers keep making it, I hope they keep it out, because this is a very well-performing pink ink, and I think pinks get overlooked quite frequently because they can be bad so many times, and yet this one is so good. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get quite a bit of shading throughout here. It's there as in you really get to see the dark spots. It's not gently shading in or out. It just simply has darker spaces in the writing. The tone, you can read it. I don't want to read a full page of it with this medium fine. Now the medium nib is much darker in tone, much better to be able to look at. It has no feather, it has no spread, it shades very, very well. I'm very happy about how this is doing, so there can be no real complaint with that. Look at how good that looks. The broad sig has no feather, no spread. It still shades really well. I'm really happy. This was a pen I put there because I thought she would enjoy it. Like I put the dry medium fine to really expose any kind of flaws there might be. Looking at the back of the page, we get minor ghosting and no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor My First pen with a medium fine nib. A Jinhao X450 with a medium nib. A Franklin Christoph Model 66 with a broad sig nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we're getting no feather, no spread. We're getting light shading, as in a few spots are darker than others. Not as much as on the Clairfontaine. This paper is really defeating it when it comes to that. It's a pretty light tone, but I think it is easier to read in its light tone than it was on the white paper. Now the medium nib has no feather, no spread. It is shading. It's not going crazy with the shading, but it is doing a really good job at it. It's just very gently in and out the entire time. The broad sig has no feather, no spread, very nice shading. Its tone is the same tone that we're getting from that medium nib. So it's looking very nice and is very easy to read, making it good for note-taking or journaling if that's what you really wanted to use it for. Looking at the back of the page, we see very minor ghosting and we get no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get light shading. I think it's looking a little bit lighter in tone than we saw on the Leuchtterm. And with that, I find this more difficult to look at and definitely don't want a whole page of it from this nib. Now, the medium, on the other hand, has a much darker tone, much easier to read, much more pleasant to look at. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has some shading going on. It's definitely there. This ink just shades so gently in and out that I think it's doing a fantastic job. The broad sig is the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, not nearly as much shading, which I was a little surprised by, but I'm thinking the shape of the nib spread the ink a little bit more, and that combined with a more absorbent paper means you might have a little bit of an issue. Looking at the back of the page, there was this spot that did come through and touch the page underneath with the medium nib. Very surprising on this paper, but it is Moleskine paper. That's the spot that came through. So there was a little bit of bleeding, as in it spotted the page underneath, but we have very minimal ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it's much lighter than we've seen on other papers, which this paper I know does. And it looks washed out here. It looks watered down. It's too light to really be useful. You can read it, just not, I don't want a page of it, nowhere near it. It's the pen with the ink. It has no feather. It has no spread. There's a few moments of shading that do occur, but I would avoid it in this case. The medium is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It only has the lightest bit of shading. Almost none, really. It still is a strong pink in its performance. The broad sig has no feather, no spread. It's the same tone that we're getting in the medium, yet here we are seeing some shading going on. So it's quite the opposite of what we saw happening with the Leuchtterm. I think it looks really good in that it's a strong pink on the page that shades very well, and shading doesn't always happen with this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we have very minimal ghosting, and we got no bleeding. Nothing came through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Cerise. Here is Pen BBS number 129. Here is Sailor Mother Pink. Here is tag Cairo Iro Cherry Blossom of Kieg. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread. This paper has been doing truly phenomenal with this. We get minor bits of shading coming in. It is, I think, a little darker than what we saw on some of the cream paper. I think the absorbency of this paper is working in its benefit with this pen. Now looking at the medium nib, it is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It is shading, which we don't always get very much of here. I think it's looking very good. I am seeing in some of the darker areas, it's leaning a little red, but I don't think that's bad in how it's doing it. The broad sig has no feather, no spread, almost no shading. There are a couple spots that look a little bit lighter, but for the most part, we're getting a very uniform tone here. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting. It did get deeper into the page, but it never came through and touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by Blackstone, Black Stump. Here is a blue ink by Colorverse, their Season 2 Quasar. Here is a gray ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, their Stone Gray. Here's a turquoise ink by Pelikan, their Edelstein Topaz. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get tiny feathers only in a couple areas, really. If you look at the T on contains, you see a couple tiny feathers. Nothing really bad. Actually, it's doing very well here. There's the tiniest bit of spread, but almost none on this. It's a Japanese medium fine, and it still very much looks like a fine nib. The medium has some feathering. You see some tiny consistent feathers through much of this writing. But again, it's a paper issue more than this ink. It does have a bit of spread that happens. That medium is writing a little bit more towards a broad. It has no shading that's going on, but it is definitely keeping its pinkness. The broad sig has tiny feathers, as would be expected. It does have a little bit of spread, as would be expected. It does not have any shading, which, again, expected. Looking at the back of the page, we see nothing touch the page on the back, which makes me feel that spot that happened on the Moleskine was a freak show, but it did happen. We see that the writing does give a normal amount of ghosting, and the bleeding had none, so it was great. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? In choosing a pen, I'm thinking about the way the color went down, and I really did not like how this looked from a dry, medium fine nib. So for me, I would absolutely avoid that. Even though it did give some shading, it was absolutely not the color for me. However, when I went with a wet medium or a wet broad to play around with this ink, I found that I really liked the color. It gave very nice shading, performed incredibly well. So a wet broad, a wet medium, which is very funny because those are the pen choices that Aziza tends to more go with. So I can completely understand why this ink works that way. Definitely a wet medium for me though. I would be interested in what happens with the double broad. I kind of wish I used it here. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.